So today we begin a brand new series that's going to take us all the way through the summer. It's a series I'm really excited about, and it's a series we're calling The Untold Story of Jesus. Jesus is the most compelling man who has ever lived on our planet. He was born 2,000 years ago in a peasant family. He lived in a backwoods town on the fringe of the Roman Empire. He never led a country or a revolt. He never really led much of anything. He never wrote anything. He didn't hold a public office. He never really left his country, didn't really travel more than 100 miles from his hometown. He wasn't even formally educated. He was a carpenter's son who didn't live past his mid-30s. Yet today he is still the most fascinating, the most polarizing, the most written about and talked about man who's ever lived. I mean, today, 2,000 years after his death, he still captivates our attention. His birth divides history between BC and AD. One out of every three people on this planet believes that he is God and have committed their lives to following him and worshiping him. Who is this man? You know, almost everything we know about him, most of what we know about him, comes from four different accounts in the Bible, what we call the Gospels, which comes from an Old English word which basically means good news. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are these four accounts of Jesus' life that give us almost everything we know about Jesus. But one of the four are very different from the other three. John, while Matthew, Mark, and Luke all seem to be kind of telling the same stories and emphasizing the same events in the same timeline, John seems to be telling a very different story about Jesus, not contradictory, but he seems to be trying to fill in the gaps of things that Matthew and Mark and Luke left out of their accounts. He brings a different purpose than the other three. He seems to bring a different perspective to tell, again, a different version of the story, filling in those gaps that the other three left out. Who was John? Well, we know that John was one of the inner 12, one of the disciples. Perhaps he was the closest of all of the 12 to Jesus. He never refers to himself as John in his gospel, but he continually calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. So after spending all that time with Jesus, there's one thing he knew: Jesus loved him. And whether he was the closest or not, we know he was one of the inner three. Jesus would often take James and John and Peter apart from the other 12 to spend special time with him. John is the only one who stood by Jesus all the way to the cross. He was there as Jesus died. As a matter of fact, as Jesus died, John and Jesus were so close that as John was standing there with Jesus' mother, Jesus asked John, "Would you please take care of my mother and take her into your home after my death?" They were like brothers. John became a prominent leader in the young church after the resurrection and subsequent ascension back to heaven of Jesus, and he was continually persecuted, imprisoned, tortured for his faith. One historical story tells us that the Roman emperor had him dipped into boiling oil to kill him, but he survived it. He was later exiled to the island of Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation. He is the only one of the disciples, though, that we believe that died of natural causes. All other of the 11 died for their faith. So that means that John was the oldest and the last surviving of all of the 12 disciples. There's two prominent theories in terms of when he wrote the book of John, when he wrote this gospel. The traditional and more popular view is that he wrote it around 85 AD, about 50 years or so after the events of Jesus, after they occurred. And John would have been an old man. That doesn't mean that the telling of the story would be inaccurate. These are stories and accounts and teachings that he would have been going over and over again all over the past decades. They would have been well etched into his mind when he finally put pen to paper in 85 AD as an older man. A more modern view, less accepted view, is that John wrote his gospel around 55 AD, or just 25 years or so after the events of Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection. But regardless of when he wrote it, what we know is that John is writing about his personal eyewitness account. He's doing it within 20 to 50 years after the events themselves. And he writes as one who clearly was there and can remember things as only one who was there would remember them. And you can see that in the detail in which he writes. You know he was there. For instance, in John chapter 12, he's telling the story of Mary anointing Jesus' feet with expensive perfume, and he writes, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. We can almost imagine John remembering back to this event when Mary is anointing his feet and just being overcome by the smell of the perfume as it filled the entire house. Or when he writes about the crucifixion, John remembers one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. A sudden flow. I mean, it's very descriptive. Only John would know that because only John was there at the cross, and he's writing about what he personally experienced, what he personally saw and witnessed, and he's sharing his unique perspective on his experience with Jesus in his gospel. He tells the story like no one else does. It seems as though he is intentionally trying to fill in the details left out by the other three gospel writers of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He's supplementing their gospels. And it seems to be that's one of the reasons John wrote his gospel. He knew about the other stories of Jesus' life. Maybe he had read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or he certainly knew the stories that they had been telling. And he probably thought, well, why didn't they tell this story or that story? How could they have left Lazarus out? I mean, come on, that was one of the greatest things ever. I mean, how could they leave that out of their gospels? And so he takes the opportunity to put pen to paper and he begins to tell the stories that no one else told. John really is the untold story of Jesus. I mean, it's said that 90% of what is in John is not included in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are some things John wants us to remember about Jesus that would have been forever lost had he not recorded his gospel. Now, in order to include what others left out, he would have to leave out a lot of what others included. And so it's really remarkable as you read through John's gospel what isn't there, what he intentionally leaves out of his account. As you look at John's gospel, there's no genealogy. There's no story of Jesus' birth. He's like, okay, everyone else told that story. I don't need to tell that story. No account of Jesus' baptism or wilderness temptation. No story of the transfiguration. In John, there are no demons being cast out or exorcisms. No stories of tax collectors. No Sermon on the Mount. No Lord's Prayer. As a matter of fact, there isn't even a single parable in the traditional sense of the word in the book of John, nor is there account of Jesus' ascension. He leaves a lot of things out, but John tells so much of Jesus' story that others don't tell. Again, it really is the untold story of Jesus. If we didn't have John, we would have so much that would have been lost. So many teachings, so many events, so many stories that John has preserved for us. And so this summer, we're going to be just kind of camping out in this gospel and looking at, we've chosen 11 different accounts in the book of John that only John gives us, that all give us a different perspective of who Jesus is. And so today we begin at the beginning, because no one else begins their gospel the way John begins his. He begins the story of the life of Jesus with such depth and grandeur. From the very first verse, we can see John's gospel is very different from the other three. He begins in a way that gets at his purpose for writing the book. John has a very distinct and a very clear purpose, and he stays on that purpose all through his book. He tells us what his purpose is for writing at the very end of the book. And in John chapter 20, he gives us his thesis statement for the entire gospel. And he says this is why he wrote the book. He said, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these, the ones that I've shared with you, are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Why is John writing? John is writing his book so that you and I will believe, and anyone who ever reads his book, we will believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Belief. This is one of the main themes in the book of John. Belief, this one word, belief. He uses this word 98 times in his letter, in his book, because he wants us to believe. And so everything he's telling us is to convince us Jesus is who he said he was, that he is the Son of God. Why? Why does he want us to believe? So that by believing you may have life. This is another major theme in the book of John, life. He uses the term 36, 37 times, more than twice as much as any other New Testament book, life. John talks about life because Jesus is the source of life. Jesus is the life. Jesus gives us abundant life. And John wants us to experience life in Christ. And so he says, I'm writing this book to you so that you will believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And by believing, you will have life. And just as he ends his book with his purpose very, very clear, so he begins his book with his purpose very, very clear. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. What a beautiful, theologically rich beginning to a beautiful, theologically rich book. Unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who all begin their telling of the story of Jesus in a historical context, John begins his telling of the story of Jesus in eternity. So Mark begins his story of the telling of Jesus by going back to John the Baptist baptizing at the River Jordan. He goes back a couple years. Luke begins by going back to the births of John the Baptist and Jesus. So he goes back a bit further, maybe 30 years, 40 years. Matthew begins with a genealogy that goes back, tracing Jesus' lineage back 2,000 years to Abraham. But as John begins the story of Jesus, he doesn't begin in a historical context. He begins in eternity, in the beginning. See, where Matthew and Mark and Luke present the divinity and the messiahship of Jesus in somewhat of an inductive fashion, they kind of slowly seek to lead you along, building their case as they go that Jesus is the Messiah. John just boldly proclaims from verse 1, He is God. He is divine. In the beginning. In the beginning. Where does Jesus' story begin? In the beginning. John begins with three very powerful, very intentionally selected words in the beginning. Where else do we read those words? Genesis, yeah. Nice job, Bible scholars. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. The first three words of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. John is very intentionally making a connection between the beginning of Jesus' story with the beginning of the story of all humanity. At the very, very beginning, he's saying, just as Genesis talks about the beginning of humanity's story, the beginning of all things, so the story of Jesus and his birth is the story of the beginning of all things. Just as in the beginning in Genesis was the beginning of man's story and Adam's story, so in the beginning for Jesus, he's making this connection that Jesus will now be this grand restarting. It's a do-over of Adam's major mess up. Jesus is coming to start things again in the beginning. Jesus not only is a new beginning, but he was present in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word. What is the Word? Who is the Word? Well, the Word is very clearly a reference to Jesus. So why doesn't John just name Jesus? Why not start his gospel, in the beginning was Jesus, and Jesus was with God, and Jesus was God? Why doesn't he do that? Well, again, John is very intentional in his choice of words. In the original Greek, the word for word is this word logos, from which we get the word logical or logic. It was a very common word, a very well-known word in first century culture, both to Greeks and to Jews. For the Greek, the word logos not only meant a literal word, but it was this grand word that really had kind of a sense of the soul of the universe. The logos represented the soul of the universe. It was this rational principle from which everything came, a creative, stabilizing, governing force of the universe. It's much like the Force in Star Wars. To the Greek mind, logos is like the Force. To the Greeks, logos was the force that held all things together. Now, for Jewish people, they didn't buy into the Star Wars version, But for the Jewish people, they saw Logos as the Word of God. They would have equated that with God himself. And so by choosing the word Logos, or word, John is instantly communicating something to both Greeks and Jews who would be reading his letter, and they would have understood what he was talking about, that more than a name, they knew he was writing about divinity, and that he was equating the story of Jesus and the beginning of the story of Jesus with the divine. And John makes it very clear with his description of the Word that the Word is divine. The Word was not only in the beginning, which meant that he was eternal before all things, but the Word was with God. Pros theou, that the Word was face to face with God the Father. Distinct from God the Father, but together with God the Father from eternity past. But not only was the Word with God, but the Word was also God. So he was with God, distinct from God, but he was also God himself. So how can this be? What is John talking about here? How could the Word be with God, distinct from him, but also at the same time be God? Well, in just a few simple, profound words, John here is offering us a glimpse of the Trinity. From eternity past, Jesus was with God and distinct from God the Father. Yet Jesus is also God. Just as much as the Father is God, so Jesus is also God. And this is an aspect of God's character that we will never fully grasp, never fully comprehend, we can't fully explain. I mean, the Trinitarian form of God means that he is three distinct beings, yet one God. He's not three gods, nor is he one God acting in three different ways. He is three distinct beings, but one God. The Bible makes it clear that God is one. Yet we have three distinct beings being called God in the Bible. The Father is called God, Jesus is called God, the Spirit is referred to as God, and they are all clearly not the same being because the Son prays to the Father, and the Father sends the Spirit and sends the Son, and the Spirit testifies to the Son, and the Son promises the Spirit. More than that, in several places in the Bible, God refers to himself in a plurality. He calls himself us and we. Again, this isn't something we could ever come close to understanding, and many have tried to explain the Trinity in ways that fall far short. I've heard the tripod illustration. It's like one tripod with three legs. I've heard the team and the family illustration, three different members, but one team, one family. I've even heard the Trinity try to be explained by Neapolitan ice cream, right? You got chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla, but all just one carton. But God is above our comprehension. Augustine, one of the church fathers, one of the smartest men who ever lived, has said, if you can explain it, if you can understand it, it's not God. The moment you think you understand it, the moment you think you can explain it, you have stopped talking about divinity because he is above comprehension. And so I like what one pastor has said. He said, since Jesus didn't try to explain the Trinity, neither will I. Right? So that's pretty good for me. But we can't understand the Trinity, but we can understand one of the major applications of the fact that God exists in Trinitarian form. And that is this. Because God is Trinity, it means God is, and God always has been, and God always will be community. God has never, ever been alone, nor will he be, but has always enjoyed the company and love and laughter and beauty of himself. The Spirit exists to glorify the Father. The Father loves the Son glories in the Father and enjoys the Spirit. I read that early church leaders described the Trinity with this word, perichoresis, which comes from two separate words, peri meaning circle, and choresis, meaning dance. The Trinity has always been and always will be this eternal dance of Father, Son, and Spirit sharing mutual love and honor and joy and respect. And so when the Trinitarian God chooses to create humanity, What he is doing is he is inviting more and more beings into this eternal dance of joy, to enjoy his joy and to enjoy his life and his laughter and his beauty. We are being called into this dance. And so, you are created in the image of God. You are created in the image of God, this Trinitarian God, which means that you are hardwired for community. That something deep within you and something deep within me craves at the very deepest sense of who we are, intimacy, connection. Right? We are called to live in community. It is because God is community and we're made in his image. This is why at Newday we value authentic community. No one is supposed to live in isolation. No one is intended to live behind a mask, hiding who they really are. We are created to know and to be known, to connect with one another in intimacy and community. We need that. We hunger for that. We are to share life with one another. And that's because it is a picture of the Trinitarian God who created us, who has always been community, and he calls us into that community. And John makes it clear that Jesus is the one who created us. Look at what he says. Through him, through Jesus, through the Word, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. Wow. Jesus. John makes it clear. Verse 3 of his gospel. Jesus is the creator. Jesus is the creative agent behind which all things were made. You and I, everything we enjoy, we owe it to him because he made it. The Rocky Mountains, he made it. The lakes that we enjoy, he made it. Your life, your children, he made it. He gave all life. Apart from him, there is no existence. The Apostle Paul writes beautifully about this in one of the best descriptions of Jesus in his letter to the Colossians. He says, "For by him, by Jesus, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers of rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Wow. What a picture John gives us of Jesus in just the first 3 verses of his gospel. Jesus is eternal. He is in the beginning. Jesus was with God, distinct from him in the beginning. Jesus was God and is God in the beginning. And Jesus is the primary agent through which all life and all things were created. And so even if Jesus didn't come and become one of us, even if Jesus didn't put on flesh and come and save us and die on the cross for us, we would already owe him everything because we would have nothing. We would not have our lives had he not created us. We already owe him our lives before he even saves us, but it is this God who did come. And John goes on to say of the Word that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Wow, the Word became flesh. Just think about that. I mean, knowing what you do about the Word, whether it's the force, but this eternal God who has always been God, has always been with God, has always been in this Trinitarian form, has always enjoyed heaven, this Word, this creative force that has made all things, became flesh. He gave up his Trinitarian form. He gave up his godness. He set aside his eternal nature and took on the form of flesh. Sarx, this kind of crude word in the original Greek, flesh. It's kind of like, really? That God would become flesh? It's just above comprehension, but that's what he did. The Word becomes flesh and came to dwell among us. This is what theologians call the incarnation. The eternal Word taking on flesh. God came to be one with us. He entered our world. He entered into our lives, into our pain, into our suffering, so he could pull us out of it. I think one of the most creative, one of the most imaginative authors, Christian authors of our day, is Max Lucado. He's able to say things like nobody else can. He's just so good with words. And I'd like to share with you an extended portion of one of his books, God Came Near, as he describes the wonder of the incarnation. It all happened in a moment a most remarkable moment. God became a man. While the creatures of earth walked unaware, divinity arrived. Heaven opened herself and placed her most precious one in a human womb. The omnipotent, in one instant, made himself breakable. He who had been spirit became pierceable. He who was larger than the universe became an embryo. And he who sustains the world with a word chose to be dependent upon the nourishment of a young girl. God as a fetus. Holiness sleeping in a womb. The creator of life being created. God was given eyebrows, elbows, 2 kidneys, and a spleen. He stretched against the walls and floated in the amniotic fluid of his mother. God had come near. He came not as a flash of light or as an unapproachable conqueror, but as one whose first cries were heard by a peasant girl and a sleepy carpenter. The hands that first held him were unmanicured, calloused, and dirty. Angels watched as Mary changed God's diaper. The universe watched with wonder as the Almighty learned to walk. Children played in the streets with him. Jesus may have had pimples. He may have been tone deaf. Perhaps a girl down the street had a crush on him, or vice versa. It could be that his knees were bony. One thing's for sure. He was, while completely divine, completely human. To think of Jesus in such a light is, well, it seems almost irreverent, doesn't it? It's not something we like to do. It's uncomfortable. It's much easier to keep the humanity out of the incarnation. Clean the manure from around the manger. Wipe the sweat out of his eyes. Pretend he never snored or blew his nose or hit his thumb with a hammer. He's easier to stomach that way. There is something about keeping him divine that keeps him distant, packaged, predictable. But don't do it. For heaven's sake, don't. Let him be as human as he intended to be. Let him into the mire and muck of our world. For only if we let him in can he pull us out. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Remarkable. Amazing. Why would he do that? Why would the Word, the eternal Word, God in Trinitarian form, why would the second person of that Trinity step out of heaven and into human flesh? John doesn't leave us guessing. He says, "Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of a natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God." Why did Jesus come? So that you and I could be restored to the family we were originally intended to be a part of. So that you and I could re-enter the cosmic eternal dance that has been going on from eternity past into eternity future, that the Trinity has been inviting us into, that he created us to be a part of, so that you and I could be restored as sons and daughters of God. That is why Jesus came. And the way into the dance, the way into the family, is simply through belief. If we could just believe in his name, we will be children of God. Believe. Do you believe? And we began a few minutes ago this morning by asking this question: who is this man? Who is this compelling man who divides history? This compelling man that we're still talking about 2,000 years after his death. Who is Jesus? Well, according to John, the one Jesus loved, he is God. He always has been God. He always will be God. He is the creative force that has made all things. He is eternal. He is creator. He is life. Will you believe he is who John experienced him to be, who John knows him to be, who John is telling us he is? And by believing, have life. One thing we're going to be constantly reminded of all summer as we go through the book of John is that John and Jesus will constantly call us to decision. Will you believe or will you remain in your unbelief? But you have to decide. He forces a decision. Now, maybe you're here this morning and you're already convinced. Maybe you've already worked this out and you are convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that he is the Son of God, and you have been enjoying life, abundant life that Jesus came to give us. But maybe you're here today and you've had questions, or maybe you've put off a decision about who Jesus really is. Maybe you know that he's a good man and a great moral teacher, but you're just not really sure about this whole Son of God thing, this divinity thing. But John makes it clear from his opening verses that he wants to lead you and me to conviction. He doesn't want to leave any doubt, any room for doubt. He wants to leave nothing in our mind that will leave us in the middle, but he forces us to one side or the other. And so I'm asking, will you believe that Jesus is who he said he is and who John believes him to be? And I hope you're going to be with us this summer as we examine John's testimony and delve into this untold story of Jesus.